Oh man, y'all better be glad I love y'all so much. The funny thing is, Skyla, one member of my staff, came and said, "What if you guys did this?" And I'm like, "That sounds like a terrible idea." And then my kids got a hold of it and like, "No, we're doing this." So the next thing we knew, we filmed that. That's a one-time only thing. So today is the day you get to see that. If you didn't come today, you don't get to see it later. And if you're watching this on film, we probably cut it out, so you haven't seen it at all. But anyway, we're in a series we're calling Full House, and I want to start off just by telling you something that I think you probably already know, but I think it might be a pathway to something deeper that we need to know about family. And it's something we teach our volunteers, especially our student volunteers and our college volunteers, our kids volunteers. One of the things we say to them all the time is that respect leads to influence. And what we mean by this is not like, that we want our volunteers to go, "You will respect my authority." That's not what we mean. It's actually better than that. What we really mean by this is that if you live your life in such a way, right, that the kids begin and students begin to look at you and respect the way your life is, that you will gain influence in their life, right? Now, managers, if you're a person who owns your own business or you're a person who leads people in the corporate world, guess what? This applies to you too. If the people underneath of you respect you, not because you're like, get the title and the placard on your desk, but because of the way you live your life, by the way that you lead, by the way that you go through your daily business, you will gain influence in their lives. Now, if I could just narrow this down just a little bit and maybe say something that might be a little bit uncomfortable, but it's something we need to wrestle with. Let's just think about it from us, adults, just for a second. Think about this for a minute. Your parents' behavior determined how much respect you had or have for them. Let's let that sit for a minute. And I'm not going to tell you how many students were nodding their heads on the front row right now because we've got 3 rows of teenagers up here. But listen, this is a big deal. Your parents' behavior determined how much respect you had or have for them. In fact, as adults, when we look back on our childhoods, oftentimes we think about it like this, that your parents' behavior, not their advice, determined whether or not you wanted to be like them or with them, or if I might add, even liked them. Now hold that thought for a minute. Because we're in a series we're calling Full House, Family Life to the Full. We talked about this, that as Jesus followers, Jesus said he came that we might have life, and have life to the full. And oftentimes we just narrow that down to our individual, lives, or that, or it gets misconstrued into some weird context that we say, well, as a Jesus follower, my life is supposed to be perfect. None of that's true, okay? But what is true is that by following Jesus, by being Jesus followers, by moving in his direction, by applying his will to our lives, by bringing our will into submission to his will, life begins to be full. Right? And that's what he said. That's what he taught his earliest followers, was that he came to bring them life, and they began to see that, even through the difficulties that they faced, even through the context of his own death, right? That after that, they came to realize that what he was really up to was making them better in life and making their lives better. That in the long run, he was going to give them hope that would redefine the way they looked at life to begin with. Now, last week, we talked about a couple of things that were a little bit uncomfortable for many of us. In fact, it might have made you think, well, maybe all of a sudden parenting is one of those things where I don't know that I can get it right. And so I gave you some language last week. I told you it's not mine. I stole it from guys like Tim Keller and John Mark Comer, and I think I've even heard Andy Stanley say this before, that when we think about following Jesus, okay, that oftentimes there's this dichotomy between real and ideal. That when you read through the New Testament, what you start to realize is that Jesus cranked the dial up on truth and cranked the dial up on what it looked like to follow God, but then also was able to plant that in what is real and understand reality. And one of the things that happens sometimes in church, and if you grew up in church and find yourself walking away, and maybe this is your first time back in a while, or this is the first church you've attended in a while, what you might have felt is something that I felt growing up in church, is that the ideal, right, and the way we're supposed to orient our lives and the way we're supposed to think about our behavior and think about who we are and what we do was so idealistic that it felt like it was unattainable, right? And that there was no firm grounding of it in what was real. Well, that's great that you want to be like that, but you obviously haven't understood how my life actually works. And so last week we wrestled with this idea that Jesus said, right, this is how he did what he did, that he was full grace and full truth all the time. And so when he cranked up the truth to where people felt condemned, he died for the condemned. Right? That he didn't soften the idea of what God's best was for any of us, but at the same time he also was willing to go all the way to the grave for those who felt condemned by it. It's this weird balance that we as Jesus followers have to live in, and this kind of tension that we live in. And the reason that I spent so much time talking about that is because I wanted you to understand this point I'm about to put on the screen. When it comes to parenting, marriage matters. It matters. And for some of us, again, like I said last week, when you heard that, you stopped taking notes, you closed your book, you crossed your arms, you're like, well, then I can't, because of what I've experienced, because of what I've been through, because of what my life looks like, then I'm never going to get there. That's not what I was trying to do, and that's not the weight that I want to even put on you today. I just simply want you to understand that your marriage matters when it comes to parenting, and how you look at it, and how you paint the ideal of what could be, even if the situation you find yourselves in is not ideal, matters to your kids, and they're watching. And so rather than just kind of strapping an anchor around your necks and saying, good luck with your marriage, we created a lot of content. And you'll have been taking so much advantage of this. This became the second highest looked at page on our website within like 10 hours of last Sunday, and I'm grateful for that. But if you go to tcat.church/marriage, all sorts of self-guided content for you. There's referral pages. If you need counseling, some of you already signed up for that, and that's great. If you want to get in a Thrive group and have other couples that kind of talk about your marriage together, work on things, it can always be better, and there's no shame. There's no shame in this, right? But there's lots of content here where you can get started to work on your marriage. Now, this is not where we're going today. That was kind of last week. But what I do want to draw out from this is one more thing to maybe not try to twist the knife, but just kind of make this land, is that Jesus consistently, right? Jesus consistently, in the way that he related to people, the one group of people he didn't seem to get along with all that much was the group of law keepers who had nothing but truth, right? And nothing but rules, and nothing but do this or else. And worse than that, they not only just had rules, they had no way to kind of step in and assist people with anything. So this, again, this is not who we want to be, but this is what Jesus said in the Gospel of Luke. Matthew, Mark, Luke, third Gospel, he says this: woe to you, and he's talking to the Pharisees, the law keepers of the day, because you load people down with burdens they can hardly carry, and you yourselves will not lift one finger to help them, right? And so, again, just to bring this point home before we move on, if you're a Jesus follower, if you consider yourself to be someone who's a disciple, you're trying your best to live your life in the way that Jesus would have you live, one of the realities, the tensions that we have to live in that camp is this, that Jesus never dumbed down the truth, but he never turned down the grace. And some of us, like, again, growing up in church, and I'm not, all my Sunday school teachers that are still watching this, okay, I love you, I promise, all right? But one of the things that it was a reality for me growing up was that I felt a lot of, like, this, but I didn't feel as much of this. Like, the truth was cranked up to 11, and I found myself, like, waiting for God to strike me down, or waiting for God to stomp me out, or waiting for God to just take me out and take me down. And what I've come to realize is God does have an ethic, and God does have a direction and a preferred future for all of us. But the moment we begin to feel condemned by not living up to that, he sent his son to die for us, the ultimate sacrifice. And that tension is where I want to live as a Jesus follower. Like, when I die and someone has to write that whole eulogy thing at the end, I hope they say something like this about me. Now, Jesus had an ethic, and it's obvious. It was we call it the law of Christ as Jesus followers today. But Jesus introduced this idea of looking at the world and looking at our relationships with each other that at first glance doesn't seem to have a lot to do with parenting, but the deeper you go in it, you realize this is the most important thing we can think about when it comes to being a mother or father or an aunt or an uncle or a small group leader or a volunteer or someone who feels the weight of the next generation. One of the things we say here at our church all the time, we ask the question, what is the faith of the next generation worth? And the answer is everything. The faith of the next generation is worth everything. Influence in the lives of the next generation is worth everything. And Jesus' New Testament ethic, what he actually says about the way the world is supposed to work or the way his kingdom is supposed to work, should shape the way we think about parenting too. Now, for a little bit of context sake for this is actually found in the Gospel of John. All the gospel writers talk about this. My favorite version of it, or my favorite giving of it, is found in the Gospel of John. This is in John chapter 13. And when he's looking at his disciples, it's kind of their, like, here's what I want you to get. Here's the whole point of what we've been talking about this whole time. He says these words: a new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. And gosh, don't miss the weight of that. Not like, okay, like Hallmark love, not like love is defined by the outside world, not as love but defined by culture, not even like marriage love. This is love as I have loved you. In the example that I have given and over the time you spent with me, I want you to love each other like that. And then, just so they don't miss the weight and importance of this, he says, by this, everyone will know that you are my disciples. If you love one another. It's not going to be by your robes, right? It's not going to be by the way you've memorized Scripture. It's not going to be by the way that you know how to sing all the songs or to sit in the right chairs. No, well, the way people will know you are mine is how you love each other. And so there's this like immediate tension of wills, right? Can I just say, again, thinking about this New Testament ethic, I don't think there's any place as a dad, I can say this because I have 4, okay? There's no place in my life that makes me so strongly wrestle with this than as a parent, right? It's sometimes easy to love people who you have casual relationships with, right? The people on the outside. I found, especially growing up in Jesus culture, that it's easy for me to be kind to people. You know, I can buy the coffee for the person in the line behind me at Starbucks or whatever, or I can, feel like I be kind and cordial to people as they go around. But like in your own home, right? When the moment that God gives you another human being and says, raise this becomes a tension. Right? Because there's no selfishness in this. Is there? I mean, there can't possibly be any selfishness in this ethic. Jesus said, love one another as I have loved you. And by the way, he said this just before he went to the cross. And so in this selfless way, I want you to love one another. Where is the better battleground for that than in our homes? Because as a parent, the moment that they hand you a child, and we all came into the world like this, okay, so I'm not just picking on kids, but all of us come into the world and we have our own agendas. Well, we have our own agendas and our own goals for what we want to do, and most of the time line up with something like this. What's in it for me? I want it my way. Right? And all of us start off like this. And it creates this tension, right? And this tug of war that ends up happening in our homes between selflessness and selfishness. And for me, again, as a dad, I just want to be vulnerable with you for a minute and own the fact that it is in this battleground where I feel like it's the greatest anxiety that happens in my life. Like this battleground between the wills that happen between myself and my kids, it's what brings out all my fear. Right? It's what brings out all my fear. It's what brings out all of my, could you go to the next slide for me, please? There we go. It brings out all my insecurity, right? All of my insecurity, the stuff that makes me feel really super uncomfortable with myself. It has a tendency, this is where all the anger starts kind of pouring out. How could you do that? I told you not to do that. Why would you do that? You ever said anything like that before? And then finally, it feels like sometimes when we're wrestling with this tension between the wills, this is when things kind of get ugly, right? I mean, don't nod your head, don't elbow your spouse, okay? But me as a dad, in the environment that I grew up in and the way that I kind of look at the world, I've never met a parent who doesn't want this, okay? But I want so much for my kids, and I want them to excel and do all of their things, and it feels like sometimes the tension that I have to wrestle with as a Jesus follower is, what does it look like for me to love them as Christ loved me, and allow them to be who they are? And how do I deal with that? Now, I'm going to tell you a couple of funny stories, and then I'm going to bring it back to this, okay? So I want to bring some levity to this moment, because if you're a parent, by now you're starting to wrestle with all of those kinds of communication things you've had with your kids. All of those tension points where it's been their will versus your will. All of those moments where it's been like, oh, this is not what I would have you do, and how you're supposed to deal with that and what you're supposed to say about it. Reggie Joyner, who's the founder of Orange, tells a really funny story at the beginning of one of his books. And he talks about the tension between reputation and relationship, right? And let me explain what I mean by this. For those of us kids, you might not know this, but for those of us as parents, oftentimes when we're out in public, for some reason, we have this temptation to allow your behavior to reflect on our reputation. See the parents, you can't see your parents nodding behind you, but it's happening, okay? It's happening. Where we live in this kind of world where like, well, if they acted like that, it's going to make me look like a bad parent, right? So if your parents have ever reacted to you kind of weird in public before because you've done something maybe goofy that you thought was not a big deal, and they're like, oh, this is why. We have this tension between reputation and relationship. So Reggie Joyner tells a story that after he got hired by his first church, he was a pastor, and he became a great kids pastor and kids director, and then went on to write great books and found Orange and all the cool stuff. But he was hired by his first church, and his oldest was very young at the time, I think 2 or 3 years old. And so he got invited to dinner with the pastor of the church and with the elders of the church and all the leadership. They were all out at dinner together, and they had sat down at this big round table, and his 3-year-old is sitting right next to him, throwing food at the elders across the table. And so Reggie, pats him 3 or 4 times, please don't do that. He's got that nervous energy. You ever felt that before? Like you're in public and you just feel like, these are people I have to impress. These are people who I care about and it's important. And the 3-year-old's throwing food at him beside him, And so Reggie pats the child 3 or 4 times, leans over, does that thing like, please stop, the eye contact. You know where the eye contact's supposed to mean more than the words? Parents, you know what I'm talking about? Like, it's like, and they're supposed to know what that means. He does that 3 or 4 times. And then finally leans over to the child, and he's embarrassed that he said this, but it's the truth. It's in the book. He grabs the kid and goes, if you don't stop, I will end you. Just like that, right? So kid doesn't stop, so Reggie picks the child up to go out, and in the middle of the restaurant, kid screams out, Daddy, please don't kill me, I love you, right? And Reggie's like, tears, all the things, okay? It's this tension we live in as parents, where it's like, and it's this tension between reputation and relationship. Now, if I could get just a little bit more personal with you for a second. For me, growing up, I felt this so much. I've told you plenty of stories about my dad. I don't want you to think that he was some sort of monster. I love my dad, and he loved me, and he had his faults and frailties and all those things. But I grew up in a home where my dad was actually a person of prominence in our community. He was in government. He was city council and then mayor. He was a business leader in our community. He was always someone who had authority. Everywhere we went, everybody knew him, and it's kind of a smaller town, so people would come to our house and ask him stuff because he had authority to be able to change things, and I grew up like that. My whole life, everywhere we went, people knew he was, I'm Donnie Oakley's son. That's what they said all the time when we were growing up, and he was the guy who was in charge of all the things. And I remember living in this tension with my dad and my mom because they didn't want that for me, but it couldn't be helped that when we were in public, we knew how we were supposed to act and what we were supposed to do. And again, I don't necessarily know that it always happened, like in the goofy Reggie Joyner story, but we felt this weight that we were supposed to be different human beings, and that it almost, in a way, and I don't think they ever said this, so I know my mom was watching this. Mom, I know you love me, okay, stop. But that maybe the reputation was more important than the relationship, right? And what it created in me and in my brother was a pathway for us to maintain this without maintaining this. We were really good at maintaining this and not so much this. And guess what? It didn't just apply to my parents, and I still have a great relationship with my mom. That's not what I'm saying. We created this kind of mental map in our minds that what people thought of us was more important than relationship. And unfortunately, parents, this is kind of what we do sometimes to our kids without thinking about it. That we have this, you need to look a certain way and act a certain way because you're my child. And what we mean by that is we want so good for you. We want the best for you. But we end up putting this mental map together that reputation is more important than relationship. And so we have to live in this tension and navigate this. And guys, students, this is not easy for us, okay? It's not easy for us as parents. And we are doing our best. But at the end of the day, you as a parent have to think about these 2 things and what they mean by you. Now, here's something else I've learned just personally as a parent. This has just been years of experience of me doing the wrong thing over and over again, okay? But what I've come to realize is that a defining moment is better than a teachable moment. And I love teachable moments, okay? I love teachable moments. They're one of my favorite things. But defining moments are so much more important. So much more important. My freshman year in college, I think I've told you all by now that I was pretty rebellious. As soon as I got out of the house and graduated, I was wrestling with this weird call in my life of what I thought God wanted me to do. I didn't really want to. I was just really happy to have freedom and get out of my house. And so I did all the wrong things my freshman year in college. And I remember my mom knew about these things. She wasn't and my dad too. And I kept waiting for them to drop the hammer, but they never did. Part of me was kind of wanting them to. It's complicated, okay? But one of the moments, and I don't even know if my parents know how important this was, one of the most important things that happened in this whole season that actually helped me, it was the voice that I heard when I started turning myself in a new direction to come back to my relationship with God and to get myself healthy again, was when my mom, knowing all of the stuff that I was doing, all the hell that I was raising, all the things, said in the middle of that, rather than going, I taught you better, or I knew better, she looked at me once and she goes, I know God has a great plan for you, and I cannot wait to see where it goes. And I'll never forget that. Like, I'm not saying that she was proud of where I was in that moment, but and she might not even know that 25, 26 years ago when she said that it would have such a definition in my life, but here we are. I know God has a great plan for you, and I can't wait to see where it goes. Acknowledge the fact that I wasn't there. Acknowledge the fact that what I was doing may not have been the plan, but loved me enough in the tension of that moment to go with grace instead of truth. And that was one of those moments where parenting was done so well. See, the Christian ethic, back to just kind of the macro force for a minute, the Bible, the New Testament is full of these moments where it talks about what it means to do one anothering, okay, to be one another. Like love one another, care for one another, carry one another's burdens, submit to one another. Like Paul has tons of these statements. And they're scattered throughout the New Testament because this whole relational thing is way more important than we give it credit for. And I know, look, I carry the same, tension in my life about my kids and wanting them to be all they can be and live up to their expectations of what they have for themselves, not necessarily what I put on them, right? It's a weird place to be. Parenting is complicated. They hand you a human being with no manual, right? And we just kind of sort it out. But in this New Testament ethic, what we understand about the way Jesus defined the life and the kingdom, one anothering is a really big deal. And the best practice ground, the best place for this to hit the most tension in your life is in your own home. Now, Paul, who again, if you're new to church and don't really know this, Paul came on to the pages of history as a person who hated Christians. If you don't like Christians very much, you're going to love Paul. He didn't like them at all, and then he became one, and then he became a really great one, and then he was the one who really wrote, Jesus had all this practical knowledge about the kingdom, and then Paul was the one that grounded it in how to live it out every day. And so as you read through the Gospels and then you turn around and read through Paul's writings, you start to get this picture of how it looks every single day to relate to people and understand people. And in what I think is probably the most commonly known definition of one anothering, or the most commonly known scripture that's listed in our New Testament, there's this definition that Paul gives for what it looks like to love. And it gets read at weddings all the time, and I know I have 3 or 4 weddings this summer, so don't hear me as picking on you. That's not what I'm saying, okay? But we rip it out of context all the time. Because we don't actually look at it as how serious and how beautiful and how amazing as it really is. We just kind of like it because it says the word love 4,000 or 5,000 times. And so in 1 Corinthians, the first letter that Paul wrote to the church at Corinth, in a church that was having infighting and struggles with each other, Paul says in the beginning of this little note, love is, and I stopped here on purpose, okay, just for a minute, and I don't want you to miss this. He's saying Christian love, if you're going to be a Jesus follower, this Jesus following love, this is not outside love, this is not like Hallmark love, this is not love story love, this is Jesus following love. If you want to be within that bounds of Jesus saying they're going to know you're my disciples by loving, he says this, and look at 3 words he ends all of us, okay? Love is patient. Love is patient. And they're like, I don't know if you're like me, but I'm like, why? Why that first, okay? Why that first? Because I'm a go person, right? The people who are on my staff know this. The people who have to lead with me, my family, they know this. I am a go all the time. And the very first thing Paul says, hey, just so you know, love is patient. Let me tell you how this fits into the scheme of parenting and how we do relationships. Y'all may not have been to this place before, but the Cincinnati Zoo, all right, so the Cincinnati, Ohio Zoo is built on a hillside, okay? And what they did was the hill kind of drapes down like this, and the zoo's in a big circle. So the zoo goes downhill to this point, and then basically you're supposed to walk downhill and then back uphill, okay? And our kids loved the zoo. We went all the time when we were there. We still go to the Birmingham Zoo, but Cincinnati Zoo was 5 minutes from where we lived at the time, so we were there a lot. And here's one of the things that I learned about Carson specifically. Carson loves to hold my hand when we're in public, and I love it, okay? I love it as a dad. It's one of my favorite things in the world, so I'm holding her hand. Now, if we're walking down the hill, and I'm walking at my pace, what's going to happen to Carson? You ever done this, parents? Come on, right? And hurrying her down the hill? But what I have to do is I have to hold her hand, and I have to walk at her pace. And then when we get to the bottom of the hill, we have to stop and get ice cream, because if we don't, then there's going to be a meltdown, right? And sometimes being patient means sitting on the side of the curb until your toddler stops her meltdown. But if I moved at my pace, which is bigger legs, and, again, I know we're going to the walrus house at the bottom of the hill, so let's just go. Why do we have to meander? Let's just get there, A to Z, let's go. If I moved at my pace, I'm dragging my child, and neither one of us are having a good time. So what I learned through that whole experience was, even though it's going to make me walk slower, I'm going to walk beside her. And I'm going to hold her hand, and I'm going to take my time. See, love being patient means moving at the pace of the other person. Moving at the pace of the other person. Now, I know that you might not get this, but I want to just hammer this home and make sure that this doesn't get missed. When we don't move at the other person's pace, what happens? Well, we separate. We end up like out in the front, and we're going, come on, come on, come on. And we're hurrying, and we're rushing. Now, that's really easy to understand in the physical world, but hey, guess what? This is something you just don't want to miss. This happens in the way that we parent. This is how relationships work. This happens in our marriages. This is how marriages work. It happens in friendships and parenting with our kids and everything else in between. If we move at our pace and not their pace, we end up separating. And so Paul began his definition of Jesus-following love as a love that moves at the pace of one another. A little bit later, in another letter he wrote to the Colossians, the church at Colossae, he says something, and I don't want you to miss the fact that he says it to fathers. So again, this is not that it's not applicable to mothers as well, but dads, cue in on this, okay? Don't miss what he says. Fathers, do not exasperate your children. Don't stretch them, don't drag them, don't push them, don't make them exhausted. Don't push them to the limit of your limit, not their limit. And he says, why, right? And again, let me just not miss the fact that he says this to fathers. And I think if I'm being super vulnerable and super honest with you, and this is hard because my kids are literally sitting in this room, but I have this tendency to do this because I see in them, right? I see their potential in them, and I just want to get them to go, and I want you to be where I know you could be, and so I'm just constantly pushing and pushing and pushing. But what ends up happening is you exasperate your children. Or, it says, here's what happens. So, or they will become discouraged. Discouraged. Now, again, because I'm a parent, I know exactly what all the parents in this room are thinking. Yeah, but listen, if I don't push them, then they won't turn, reach their own potential, and they won't get where they won't, and they can't, and they won't. Let me finish that sentence for you for a minute. They may not turn out the way you want them to turn out. Can we just sit in this for a minute? See, the difficulty and the tension that we live in as parents, students, is that we see you in a lens that you don't get to see. We've known you as long as you've been alive, and when we look at you as our children, we look at you in what we hope could be. But sometimes parents, we have this tendency to define this for them rather than helping them discover it themselves. My favorite verse in the Bible, Ephesians chapter 2, 8 through 10. I talk about this all the time. But after talking about salvation, he says, this grace plus faith plus nothing, right? After that, he says, for we are God's handiwork or masterpiece, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God has prepared in advance for us to do. And so parents, what we do sometimes to our kids without knowing about it is we have good works we prepared in advance for them to do. And we unfortunately keep them from seeing what God prepared for them to do. Now, do you know how best to combat this? Do you know how best to kind of battle against this and keep this from happening? It's the same thing that if you work in the corporate world, you've been asked tons and tons of emotional IQ tests and all this other stuff, but it boils down to one very simple thing, and it's called self-awareness. Now, self-awareness is important for everybody, for students, for adults, for everybody in between. Just being aware of ourselves, our emotional quote. We raise the bar just a little bit in our awareness of the tension that lives in us. And the thing is, this is what's crazy, and this is not a Jesus follower thing, this is just kind of a humanity thing, but people say all the time, do you know what the number one influence on self-awareness is? The environment in which you grew up. So, again, the faith of the next generation, what is it worth? What's it worth? Everything. And furthermore, parents, relationship with your kids, what is it worth? You know, this tension that we live in between grace and truth as we parent and as we live in our marriages and all the other things we do, it's not a tension that's uncommon. All of us live in it every single solitary day. You know, one of the best things that ever happened to me, my dad wanted me to be an engineer my entire life. He wanted me to go to engineering school, and he wanted to, he had this dream for me to go to engineering school. It was my dream too, so it kind of aligned. But then when I graduated, right around the time that I graduated, I finally accepted the fact that I was supposed to be a pastor. And I was convinced that going to my dad, being who he was and the dreams that he had and all the things, of going to my dad and saying, I'm not going to be an engineer, Dad. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to become a pastor instead. I was convinced he was going to be disappointed. And so I went and I had that talk with my dad. And again, I'll never forget this. He looked at me and he goes, son, I am so proud of you. See, love is patient. Love moves at the pace of the other. And I was about to, and still even to this day, living into what God had built me to do. And maybe we figure that out when we're 15. Maybe it's a little bit later. But the tension, again, that your parents live in, the tension that we as parents wrestle with every single day, is how do we do this well? So students, give us some grace. Parents, give yourself some grace. And revel in the fact that Jesus himself said, loving one another, that all the other stuff hangs on that, right? It didn't mean that the law went away. It didn't mean that there is no law or whatever. He just meant, look, loving one another. If you love people as I love you, then all the law and all the prophets and all the other stuff, it comes out. The whole point driving that at the end of the day was to get you to love one another. And so I want to leave you with a couple of questions, and then we're going to wrap this up. Parents, what do you want from parenting? And I don't mean that you're some sort of consumeristic thing. I just mean like this season that you have, these 18 years that you have while your kids are living in your home. What do you want to get out of that? A long time ago, Shannon and I said, and this is kind of silly, but we said it. It was our goal. And we got a lot of those stuff we care about too, but this is just the thing that came out of our mouths when we were talking about it. We wanted to parent our kids in such a way that when they didn't have to be around us anymore, they still wanted to. And that they wanted to be around each other too. Because we've just seen too many, I felt it. As soon as I graduated, I'm never going home again, and I just didn't want to feel that. I don't want my kids to feel that. But what's your goal? What's your dream? We want our kids to be Jesus followers. We want our kids to be rooted and grounded in the truth and the word and the grace of Jesus. That was something we parented towards. What are you parenting towards? And are you outpacing who you're leading? It's an everyday thing. And sometimes we get it right, and sometimes we don't. And there's grace from God between. But don't miss those moments, because they're so special, and they're so important, and they will be remembered. I'd love to pray for you as we think about this, and then we'll close out our time. Would you bow your heads with me? Heavenly Father, I'm just so grateful for the way you love us, the way you've trained us to love each other. God, we're grateful for the gift of parenting. I am grateful to be a dad. It's hard, and it's difficult, and it's beautiful all at the same time. Lord God, we just pray that each and every one of us in this room, we all had parents. Either we are a parent, we have parents, we've been influenced by parents. All of us have been brought up somehow in some way. God, what needs to be redeemed by you, what needs to be healed by you, we just give it to you in the name of Jesus. But what could be and what should be, we beg and we plead through the power of your Holy Spirit to align with the way you have asked us to love. Redeem us where we need to be redeemed, and shore us up where we need to be shored up, and everything in between. Help us to define our relationships in the way that you would have us love one another. God, we love you. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you all so much for coming to TCAT this weekend. God bless you. Have a great week, and we'll see you back Sunday next week for part 3. Bring somebody, all right? Take care.